What if the person you love most became your worst prison? At first, everything seemed like a fairy tale, a sweeping romance, promises of a perfect future, words that envelop you like a soft melody. But little by little, the notes change. Affection turns into possession, care becomes control, and love becomes a trap. Marina believed she had found the man of her dreams. But what began as an overwhelming passion soon turned out to be a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. For 10 years, her life was shaped by a cruel cycle of manipulation, isolation, and fear, until one day, something happened. Something that made the last piece of this sick puzzle fall into place. And at that moment, she realized, either she ran away, or there would be nothing left of her. But escaping from someone who knows you better than you know yourself is harder than it seems. And this is the story of the woman who had to defy the impossible in order to break free. How far would you go to save your own life? The sun was pouring over the busy streets of the small coastal town, reflecting golden hues on the calm water of the harbor. Marina adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder as she walked alongside Sophia, soaking up the lively vibe of the place. They had saved for months for this trip, a brief escape from the monotonous routine of their lives in the big city. It was in the cafe of a picturesque square that fate unfolded before her. A tall man with an easy smile seemed at ease among the tourists, engaged in a lively conversation with a group of friends. Marina noticed that he glanced at her from time to time, as if assessing her presence. When their gazes finally met, he didn't hesitate. He stood up and approached her. "I couldn't help noticing that you seemed to be new here." The nonchalant tone and confidence with which he carried himself gave Marina an immediate feeling of enchantment. James, as he introduced himself, was effortlessly charming, with a penetrating gaze and a velvety voice. They talked for hours, and every word he said seemed to have been chosen to envelop her. He made her laugh. He made her feel special. That evening, as they walked along the promenade illuminated by old street lamps, Marina felt like she was in one of those novels she used to read. James held her hand naturally and promised that this was just the beginning. "Do you believe in instant connections?" he asked. She didn't know how to answer, but at that moment she wanted to believe. Over the next few days, what had been a fleeting flirtation turned into something more intense. James always knew the right words to say, appeared in the right places, and created moments worthy of a fairy tale. Marina found herself entangled in his attention, as if he were a gravitational force impossible to resist. Sophia, watching her friend fall in love so quickly, expressed her concern. "This is going too fast, Marina. You hardly know him." But Marina laughed, convinced that fate had finally presented her with something great. When James proposed that she stay longer in the city, Marina hesitated for a moment, but deep down she already knew the answer. What was her life before him? A predictable sequence of dull days and dreams deferred. Now she felt she was part of something bigger. The wedding took place shortly afterwards, in an intimate ceremony. Marina wore a simple dress, but James made her look like the most stunning woman in the world. The promise of eternal love resounded in their vows, and she believed every word. The house they moved into was spacious and well-decorated, full of memories of James's family. But soon, Marina began to notice small details that had previously gone unnoticed. His sisters treated her with calculated distance, and her mother-in-law made a point of reminding her, with subtle comments, that James had always been a special man, someone to be cared for and admired. In the first few months, the differences were easy to overlook. James was still the charming man she had fallen in love with, and the little moments of coldness were quickly overshadowed by gestures of affection. But one evening, while organizing the living room, Marina found a box of mementos from James's childhood. Inside there were letters, photos, and even newspaper clippings kept with a strange zeal. Before she could understand the reason for her restlessness, she felt his presence behind her. "What are you doing?" His dry tone and the rigidity in his expression made her recoil. She had never seen him like that before. "I was just tidying up," she replied, trying to sound calm. He closed the box with an abrupt movement and then smiled. The smile that used to make her melt now seemed forced. "Some things must remain in the past, love." Marina wanted to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. After all, their love was strong, wasn't it? Marina and James's home was beautiful, decorated with sophisticated furniture and neutral colors. But there was something about it that made her feel like a visitor, someone who had to fit into a space where the rules had already been established long before her arrival. James's family orbited around him with an almost religious devotion. His mother, Eleanor, had a stern look on her face, always assessing her daughter-in-law's every move. His sisters, Charlotte and Vivian, never openly showed hostility, but there was an air of exclusion in every glance exchanged between them. Marina realized that for all of them, James wasn't just a man. He was a pillar, a symbol of the family that had to be protected at all costs. At first, Marina thought it was all just a question of adapting. But as the months went by, it became clear that it wasn't just his presence that was being tolerated with difficulty. Her own identity was beginning to dissolve within that new world. At first, James's requests seemed harmless. He liked an impeccably organized house, carefully prepared meals, and neatly ironed and folded clothes. "I just like things my way," he said, smiling. Marina, wanting to be a good wife, made every effort to meet his expectations, but the requests became silent obligations. If the house didn't look the way he wanted, there would be a disapproving look. If the food didn't have the right seasoning, a dry comment was thrown into the air. Gradually, she realized that there was never any praise, only corrections, only remarks about how something could be improved. One evening, while collecting the dinner plates, Marina let a glass slip out of her hands. The sound of the glass shattering on the floor made her hold her breath. James, who until then had seemed distracted by his cell phone, looked up in a slow, controlled manner. "You need to be more careful, Marina." It was a simple sentence, but said with a coldness that sent a shiver down her spine. The next day, she became more cautious with every move. The first real sign of danger came weeks later. Marina had gone out to visit Sophia, who was passing through town, without telling James. When she returned home, she found him sitting in the living room, waiting. Her gaze was dark, her expression immobile. "Where were you?" she explained, but James didn't seem interested in her answer. He stood up slowly, walked over to her, and held her face tightly between his hands. "You need to warn me before you leave." The stiffness in his fingers made her heart race. When he released her, he smiled and kissed her forehead. "It's only because I care about you." That night, Marina couldn't sleep. The silent warning echoed in her mind. James was a passionate man. He always had been. But now, love seemed to have sharp edges, too sharp for her not to cut herself. The move to the new house was supposed to be a fresh start. At least, that's what Marina kept telling herself as she looked at the boxes piled up in the living room. The room was spacious, with large windows that let in unrestricted sunlight. A few meters away, a dirt road meandered through a dense forest, taking them away from their surroundings and the outside world. James smiled at her contemplative expression. "Now we have a place of our own, without interference." Marina nodded, trying to share her husband's excitement. But as he talked about how nice it would be to have more privacy, she felt a weight settle inside her. The first few days were quiet, marked by the smell of freshly painted wood and the promise of a new phase. James seemed pleased with the change, and, for a while, Marina allowed herself to believe that the tensions of the past were behind them. But she soon realized that this isolation didn't make her any freer. Visits to the city became increasingly rare. When she suggested going out, James would find a reason for them to stay. If he needed something, he would go and get it himself. If he mentioned missing Sophia, he reminded her that he now had everything he needed at home. "You have me, Marina. Isn't that enough?" There was something about the way he said it that made her swallow her words. The routine became a predictable cycle of carefully measured steps. She cooked, cleaned, and waited for him. When he arrived, he would smile and hug her, praising her dedication. But there was an unspoken expectation in the air. If something wasn't as he liked it, silence would linger at the dinner table. Over time, the gestures of affection were accompanied by shadows. If Marina took too long to reply to a message, he would ask her why she was so distracted. If she laughed alone while looking at her cell phone, he wanted to know why. Once, she forgot her phone in the living room. When she returned, she found James scrolling through her messages. "Don't you trust me?" she asked, taking the device from his hands. "Of course I do. But you trust me too, don't you?" The intonation sounded like a trap. Marina felt a tightness in her chest, but forced a smile. "Yes, I do." He wrapped his arms around her and kissed her shoulder. "Then, there's nothing to worry about." But there was. The excuses started to come more frequently. He was never wrong. When his voice rose, he blamed the stress of work. When he held her tightly by the wrist, he said he didn't realize his own strength. And when he saw her crying, he apologized, saying that he loved her more than anything. "You know I wouldn't do anything to hurt you, don't you?" And Marina wanted to believe it. But every time she looked in the mirror, her eyes became duller. Loneliness became as present as the very air she breathed. Whenever she tried to tell someone something, it was as if her words lost their power before they were even spoken. Even her mother, in a rare phone call, played down her anguish. "Marriage is like that, my child. It has its ups and downs." And then Marina learned that inside that isolated house, her voice had no echo. The clock on the wall read 3 in the afternoon when Marina hung up the phone, feeling a tightness in her chest. She had gotten an opportunity to give private lessons to children in the neighboring town, a chance to regain some of her independence. The school principal seemed satisfied with her qualifications, and the thought of leaving that house for a few hours a day brought her a spark of relief. When she told James the news, she expected resistance. But to her surprise, he just smiled. "A job? That's interesting." The ambiguous answer put her on alert, but he didn't say anything more at that point. The next day, while Marina was getting ready to go out, James watched her from the threshold of her bedroom door. "You don't have to work. I'll take care of everything for us." She tried to keep her voice steady. "But I want to. It's good for me." He stared at her for a moment too long before taking a step forward and fixing a loose strand of her hair. "As long as it doesn't get in the way of our wedding." She smiled and headed off to school, trying to ignore the feeling that she had just made a mistake. For the first few days, classes were her little bubble of freedom. The children liked her, and the principal praised her dedication. However, the feeling that she was being watched followed her there. James started dropping in on her at school, bringing her coffee, picking her up at the end of the day, monitoring her timetable. He smiled at the teachers and presented himself as her caring husband. But when they were alone, Marina felt the tension growing. "You don't get back to me straight away," he commented one evening while they were having dinner. "I was teaching. What if it was an emergency?" She sighed, trying to stay calm. "You can't expect me to be available all the time." James put down his fork, wiped his lips with his napkin and smiled. "But I do." The answer sent a shiver down her spine. The small gestures of control intensified. If she was slow to reply to a message, he would ask where she had been. If she mentioned something about work that he didn't know yet, James demanded details. The following week, Marina found the lock on her front door had been changed. "Why did you do that?" she asked, trying to hide the desperation in her voice. "Security measures. Don't you think it's dangerous to go out and leave the house vulnerable?" She bit her tongue to keep from asking if he considered her a risk. But the last straw came on an apparently banal evening. An unimportant argument, a dirty plate in the sink, An impatient response. Marina turned to leave the kitchen, and that's when she felt his hand on her arm. The tug was quick but brutal. She stumbled, hitting her hip on the edge of the table. For a second, time stood still. James released her immediately and ran his hands over his face. "I didn't mean to. You know I would never do that." Marina brought her fingers to the sore spot and pulled away. "But you did." The silence between them was deafening. For the first time, Marina didn't just feel afraid. She felt that if she didn't get out of that house, she might never really leave. The night was freezing when Marina felt the sharp wind against her skin. The sound of the lock turning behind her made her heart race. The door was locked. Inside, James stood impassive, watching her through the window with a look that mixed coldness and superiority. "This is for you to learn to respect the rules," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. She tried to open the door again, panic rising in her chest. "James, please." But he just crossed his arms as if he was waiting for her to beg more. The empty street seemed like an abyss. The neighbors were far away, and the city was even further away. The cold tore at her skin, and Marina felt the first twinge of genuine despair. She knocked harder on the door. "Let me in!" James didn't answer. Instead, he switched off the lights in the room and left her there, alone in the darkness. Marina hugged her body, trying to hold back the tremors. She stood there for minutes that seemed like hours, her mind spinning between fear and anger. She always tried to justify her actions, but now something inside her broke. When the door finally opened, James looked down at her, a satisfied smile on his lips. "I hope this has taught you something." Marina walked in without saying a word, but that night, lying in bed next to him, she knew there would never be another chance. She had to leave. The next day, Marina went to her mother-in-law's house. Eleanor greeted her with the same indifferent expression as always. "James overdid it yesterday," Marina began, feeling her own voice breaking. "But that's not right. He needs help." The answer came dryly. "You have to understand that James has always been like this. He's intense, passionate." Marina clenched her fists. "That's not passion." Eleanor sighed, straightening the sleeve of her jacket. "Do you think you'll find something better out there? Do you want to throw away everything you've built?" The look in her mother-in-law's eyes was cold, almost bored. "If it were up to me, I'd know what to do. A marriage requires sacrifices, Marina." She opened her mouth to reply, but realized it wasn't worth it. At that moment, she understood that there was no one to save her. She would have to save herself. That night, Marina waited until James was asleep. Her body trembled as she grabbed a small bag and put only the essentials inside. Cell phone, documents, a little hidden money. Nothing that would attract attention. Each step to the door seemed like an eternity. As she turned the handle, she held her breath. The wood creaked. She froze. James stirred in bed, muttering something. Marina closed her eyes and waited. Silence. With her heart hammering in her chest, she slipped outside, feeling the cold night air envelop her skin. 1 step, 2, 3, and then, for the first time in years, she ran without looking back. The damp asphalt reflected the distant lights of the city as Marina ran, her bare feet scraping against the rough ground. The wind cut through her skin, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The silence of the night was interrupted only by the sound of her rapid breathing and the rustling of the trees around her. Every step she took seemed to echo inside her chest like a drum marking her escape. Her body ached, her lungs burned, but adrenaline drove her on. Every meter she walked was a step away from the invisible prison that had held her for so long. She didn't know exactly where she was going. She just ran. After what seemed like an eternity, Marina spotted a small abandoned building by the side of the road, an old wooden shed forgotten by time. Her heart racing, she pushed open the worn wooden door and huddled in a dark corner, hugging her knees to her chest. There, alone, she let the tears come. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't fear. It was a weight dissolving layer by layer with each sob. She was free, But what now? The first dawn away from James was silent. Marina woke up to the first rays of sunlight coming through the cracks in the wood and felt the morning chill penetrating her skin. With heavy eyes and stiff muscles, she left the shed and walked slowly to the road. He didn't know where to go, but that didn't matter. Any road was better than the one he had left behind. Then his phone vibrated. He hesitated for a moment before looking at the screen. 32 missed calls. James's name flashed like a threat. Her chest tightened, the fear returning with force. The messages came soon after. First, a series of desperate apologies. Then, sentences full of anger. The abrupt change in tone didn't surprise her. "Go home now. You can't do this to me. You're mine, Marina." She trembled, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was revolt. She deleted the messages and blocked the number. Her heart was pounding as she raised her face to the open sky. For the first time, there were no invisible chains around him. There was still a lot to face, but now, finally, she had something she thought she had lost for a long time: a choice. She took a deep breath and took the first step into the future.